Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to this year's last lecture. I'm Megan Scanlon. I'm the president of CUEB, and we are grateful that all of you are here. We are honored to have President Wilde as our guest this year speaking. Just a little bit about him. He became the 9th president of North Central in 1991. He graduated from Amherst College with high honors in 1967 and earned a PhD in government from Harvard University. In 1979, he became special assistant to the president of the University of Wisconsin system, and 2 years later, vice president for external relations at Beloit College. During Dr. Wilde's 21-year tenure as president here, students have benefited from significant increases in scholarship support, a renewed emphasis on academic excellence, major physical improvements to campus, and a broadened commitment to international programming, service learning, and interdisciplinary studies. As president, Dr. Wilde is extensively involved in college life. He gets to know as many students as he can through activities such as Pizza with the Prez. He attends athletic events, theatrical productions, musical performance, and other student activities. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Hal Wilde.
Thank you. I'm honored to present this year's last lecture, but I must confess that producing it has been a bit of a struggle. In my more than 21 years at North Central College, I've delivered thousands of talks to students, faculty, staff, the community, trustees, alumni, and others. Some, such as my old man story at commencement, I repeat year after year, but most are written from scratch on a yellow pad, typed by assistants who have learned the fine art of translating my chicken scratches, and then revised over and over again. This talk is different. To understand that difference, we must turn to my first adult job after completing my doctorate at Harvard, writing speeches for the then governor of Wisconsin, Patrick Lucey. That was 40 years ago this September. Pat Lucey was the perfect partner for me in finding my adult voice. He was enamored of smart young people with Ivy League credentials. He was eager to absorb the latest in social science research. He was comfortable in his own skin and his unparalleled knowledge of state and federal politics. And he was fearless in pushing the edge of the public policy envelope. Years later, I would look back on the speeches I wrote for him as the best writing I ever did. I learned one of the reasons why when he appointed me Wisconsin's insurance commissioner in 1975. Suddenly, I wasn't writing speeches for the governor, a father figure who rarely criticized what I wrote except to complain about my using way too many syllabled Ivy League words. I wasn't writing for the governor. I was writing for myself, and I felt all the constraints and potential political costs of every word. Gone, too, was the certitude I had as a kid just out of graduate school, that I had all the answers, that I knew where the planet needed to move. Instead, there was the more adult and cynical sense of how to move audiences without saying anything risky. I should tell you one of my favorite memories as speechwriter for Pat Lucey was a talk he gave to the American Legion of Wisconsin in the arena in Milwaukee at the height of the Vietnam War, where he received a standing ovation from the audience while calling for amnesty for draft resistors, although I don't think that's what the audience understood he was saying. That's what a speechwriter can do. That's what a good speechwriter can do. My speeches as insurance commissioner And in all the years of higher education that followed at the University of Wisconsin system, at Beloit College, and here at North Central, reflected the adult me. My voice, my inner voice, whatever it was subsumed to the larger purpose of an office, a position, a set of responsibilities, advancing an agenda, or dodging a bullet. And so it is in my years at North Central, I've always spoken as the president, to a degree that after more than 2 decades, it's hard for me to sort out where the office stops and I start. Which brings me to the challenge of tonight's talk. Indeed, the challenge I will face most acutely on January 1st, 2013. The challenge of finding that inner voice and discovering if there is any there when I am no longer President Wilde. There's a line in a Stephen Sondheim musical where the singer says, "I have nothing to say," that echoes in my mind when I'm not writing for someone else or for a role that I'm not playing, a role that I am playing, rather. Shortly after I became president of North Central in March of 1991, I was invited back to Beloit College, where I'd spent 10 years, the previous 10 years, to deliver their last lecture. I'd forgotten this until I received CUAB's gracious invitation, and my wife Benna reached into her bottomless file cabinet and found it. It was an okay speech, but it was political, not personal, written to reinforce the conviction of the audience that the liberal arts education they were receiving was the best possible preparation for life. I thought of recreating that speech tonight. I still believe it, but it was the voice of a college president, and the words were those of a speechwriter who knew how to sound right and make an audience feel good about itself. So stripping away all the constraints and the speechwriter's artifice, talking to you not as President Wilde, but as Hal Wilde, 67 years old this very day, not a little scared about the next act in what has been a most fortunate life, do I have anything to say? If my last lecture at Beloit was political, not personal, more a booster shot for the school I was leaving than a reflection on life experiences that might be of some use to listeners struggling with similar challenges and issues in their own lives, there was a reason for that. I grew up in a Missouri-Synod Lutheran household. Any Missouri-Synod Lutherans out there? Got to be careful. In which the oft-repeated mantra was, "It's not about you, Hal." To tell your life story was to engage in puffery, as in, who do you think you are? That was then. But 21 years later, I'm tempted to go to the opposite extreme. This talk will be personal, not political. I don't know how many of you saw a story in the Wall Street Journal a week ago or so about neuroscience research, and it talked about the fact that people talking about themselves lit up some area of the brain, the same area, I think, if when you were smoking marijuana or whatever, it's just same sort of, and the older you get, the more you want to light up that area of your brain. I can tell you that. But this talk won't be about North Central College. It won't even be about higher education. It will be personal. One caveat, though. The most important personal choice of my life divides into BB and AB, and I guarantee you I wouldn't have made it this far without the AB. That part of my life is off limits. So are my dear children who have been among my most important teachers over the last 40 years. I'll save that talk for another day when Benna isn't sitting here. Above all, this talk will be about faith, not the biblical faith in which so many of us are grounded. I've always regarded that faith as something both private and personal. In fact, I've kidded over the years when asked to preach a sermon in Coton Chapel that a lightning bolt would come down from the sky to smite me. And I worry about that. The faith that I'm referring to has its roots closer to home. My mother died a year ago at age 95, almost 50 years after the death of my dad. My dad's death shaped her life and my siblings' life in profound ways. My mother was a churchgoer and an ardent member of the choir, but I cannot remember ever speaking to her about her religious faith. Instead, as I've reflected on her life over the past 12 months, what I keep coming back to is a kind of indomitable optimism that never left her, even in the wake of the shattering loss of her husband, with 4 children to worry about at age 45. That's the faith I want to talk about tonight. As kids, we used to think of my mom as a practitioner of a kind of what we called benign obliviousness. And we thought she was channeling the pious platitudes of Norman Vincent Peale and Dale Carnegie. I don't even know if you students know who Norman Vincent Peale and Dale Carnegie are, but you should check them out. Google them. Not now. Dale Carnegie's course, by the way, Warren Buffett refers to as the most important educational experience in his life, so that tells you something. Anyway, my mother, with her benign obliviousness, channeling those pious platitudes. As a kid, where we would see nasty playmates and tyrannical teachers, she would have none of it. It drove us crazy. Naive, Pollyannish. Why couldn't she take our side? Ever. But somewhere along the way, her attitude taught one of the most important life lessons. In your dealings with others, always assume good faith and put yourself in their shoes. And don't assume when something bad happens to you, and something bad happens to all of us once in a while, like you don't get a part in a play that you wanted or whatever, don't assume that there's some sort of conspiratorial explanation. 9 times out of 10, when what occurs isn't what you wanted, the reason is banal, simple, and impersonal. It's not all about you. Remember that lesson. Remember it. I'm very serious. I can tell you story after story from 21 years at North Central where people assume things, and it has nothing to do with what they assume. It's not all about you. Very important life lesson. But my mom's faith, or her benign obliviousness, shaped me in other ways. We live in the age of helicopter parents. She was just the opposite. Imagine going off to a school 1,000 miles away that your mother never saw until your graduation. Imagine quitting school as a sophomore, as I did, and hitchhiking 10,000 miles at age 19 all across the country, and never getting a harsh word from your ma when you called up and said, "Oh, I'm in Las Vegas. Oh, I'm in Lake Tahoe. Oh, I'm in Sequim, Washington." Once My mom was driving in a tough part of Milwaukee, and at a stop sign, a menacing man opened her car door and jumped in. She turned to him and asked, "Where can I take you?" He was so nonplussed, he let her drive him home. End of story. And there were many, many like it. Assume good faith. Your innocence will protect you. And for 95 years, it did. I've thought a lot about my mom's faith recently, not just because of her death, but in response to the fear I see in many in your generation, including at times my own children, in confronting the future. If I could summarize this talk in one sentence, it is: if you think that the man you see up here with a wonderful life, 3 great children, a wonderful wife and life, 3 great children, and 4 fabulous grandchildren, and a well-paying job that he loves, if you think that this guy up here didn't face the abyss many times in his younger life, jobless, uncertain, confused, or if you think the challenges confronting our nation in 2012 are not similar to those we faced in 1972 or 1982 or 1992, let me just go over a little personal history and see if I can find a lesson or two in it for you. But first, a little sidebar. For as long as I can remember, questions of conscience have been an obsession of mine. Like, will you do the right thing when confronted with the hard questions of life? Or will you be a good German, maybe because I come from German stock? Like the men profiled in a book I read as a kid by an author named Milton Mayer called They Thought They Were Free, a book that was a powerful influence in my youth. Later, after my stint in state government, the issue expanded to become, how do we train men and women to be just leaders, to do the right thing when exercising power? Plato's question. Ultimately, the question of character, and perhaps the most important lesson any of us can teach. A few weeks ago, I read a book by an author named Eel Press called Beautiful Souls, in which I learned of the example of someone no one in this room has probably ever heard, Paul Gruninger, a lieutenant in the police department of the Swiss canton of St. Gallen, who was convicted by Swiss authorities in World War II, in the early part of World War II, for violating the law after illegally admitting hundreds of Jewish refugees into Switzerland who faced certain death in Nazi Germany. The full story of Paul Gruninger and others described in Eel Press's short little book is well worth reading. What I found most powerful in his story were the 2 facets that the author, reconstructing Gruninger's life years afterward, found most salient. First, his tolerance. People were people. People in need were people in need, not defined by their religion or their nationality. I can't remember whether he was Protestant or Catholic, but he certainly wasn't Jewish. But that wasn't the way he was raised. People are people. The second salient reality about Paul Gruninger, he had a naive, simple faith that his nation, Switzerland, stood for something special. Indeed, the kind of hospitality he was willing to extend to Jewish refugees, regardless of the law. He thought his country stood for that kind of openness. I make no claim to being a Paul Gruninger or having to have ever confronted the kind of a choice he did, but in exploring who I am, which I've done in thinking about this talk, those 2 themes hit home. I was only slapped by my mother once in my life as a child. I was repeating a kid's ditty, which included an ethnic slur. You'd never, ever use that word. Ever. Intolerance of others because of their race or religion or background was not acceptable in our conservative Republican household. Ever. Equally powerful in my upbringing was a belief in what I have come to think of as America's civic religion. When I review papers I wrote as an undergraduate political science major, work I did in graduate school, even the speeches I authored for Governor Lucey, when I think about my involvement in the periphery of the civil rights movement and the anti-war movements in the 1960s and 70s, what amazes me is how much faith I had, and still have, in the promise and possibility of America. I studied and even taught African American history. I taught in the first section of African American history ever taught at Harvard University. So I knew the worst of our nation. Incidents such as the My Lai massacre in Vietnam were an important part of my worldview. Yet always deep down there was a belief that the better nature of our nation would succeed in the end, that our institutions would allow good eventually to triumph over evil. Just like Paul Gruninger, a belief that is at times hard to sustain in today's political climate. Well do I know, some of the times it seems that the whole game is rigged. It's a hard belief to sustain, but believe me, it's worth sustaining it. Taking the long view, the civil rights movement of my lifetime, the women's rights movements of my lifetime, the gay rights movement of my lifetime, have powerfully reinforced the sense that the arc of history is moving in the right direction, and it's moving in a framework that allows these things to happen. I think that faith that I had and have began with my father, a more worldly person than my mother, not an optimist by nature, certainly not naive, someone who had been involved in political battles at both the state and national levels along the way, but who nevertheless taught us to revere America's civic religion, who viewed being honest and paying his taxes as a democratic debt. A rock-ribbed conservative Republican who would not let his children close their eyes to poverty, discrimination, and inequality, but who believed America's social problems are best addressed close to home, recognizing that if we didn't do our part, government further and further away from home would have to. I should tell you that I share that conservative conviction, which is perhaps why I've spent most of my adult life immersed in the unique local community that is a small college campus, because it's a place where you can make a difference. I should tell you one of my dad's phrases that I still can hear. My dad had no patience, no tolerance for people that he described as bleeding for all humanities, but ignoring the problems and challenges of their own kids. I carry that within me. It starts with your family. So tolerance, civic faith, it's a fortunate place to start a life journey. And a secure home. And a home where, to quote the George W. Bush, there was not the soft bigotry of low expectations, ever. The expectations were always high, and they were never said. My parents never said you had to get A's. They just expected it. Pure and simple. No ifs, ands, buts. Anyway, a secure home, tolerance, civic faith. But my dad's death at age 51 interrupted the sheltered trajectory of this suburban Milwaukee boy's life in the summer between my junior and senior years of high school, to the degree that little of my future course or that naive faith I had as a kid made sense. The path that brought me to North Central College more than a quarter century later was anything but guaranteed. It was filled with happy accidents in the midst of what I look back upon should have been terrifying uncertainties. I won't take you through all those moments, but I'd like to touch on a few, not because the end of the story, the 21 wonderful years we've had at North Central College, is where all of you want or should want to take your lives, but because as you confront fears about money, debt, joblessness, raising a family, illness, and tragedies, you are not alone. Your parents have been there. Your grandparents have been there. Your friends and colleagues have been there. God knows I've been there. The only people who believe there was a mythical golden age, the Eisenhower years, the Reagan years, the Clinton years, don't know their American history. A rigorous liberal arts education and the tools and friendships and values and experiences you take from this place are a great start, as they were for me at Amherst College, a time to find myself as a young man. But equally important is the willingness and the faith to persevere, to keep on learning and working and working and working and working and learning until you find what and where you are meant to be. Every time Benna was pregnant with one of our children, I was out of work. Think about that. I was out of work. My mother's a widow. There was no safety net. And every time what I thought were great options blew up. And as the clock ticked toward midnight, I was saved by friends and mentors who had more faith in me than I had in myself. The first time we were house sitting for a summer in Concord, Massachusetts, my PhD thesis had just been handed in. My grant and the money that had supported me in graduate school and our money had run out. I had turned down the offers I'd been given for teaching jobs, deciding that I wasn't a great teacher. I had no idea what I would be doing in a month when our house-sitting job was done, and Benna was pregnant. One afternoon, I went out walking in a rainstorm around Walden Pond, the Rose Walden Pond, which is about a half mile from the house we were sitting in, trying to clear my head and asking the Lord for guidance. Forgive the melodrama here, but when I got back, sopping wet, Benna hollered, "Where you been? You just got a call from the Wisconsin governor's office." Out of the blue. I'd been put on a list of prospects without my knowledge by a University of Wisconsin professor. Long story short, 1 month later, all our possessions in a rental truck, I still hadn't been offered the job. I got on the Mass Pike. We drove into New York. I got on they didn't have cell phones back then. I got on a phone. I called the governor's office. I told them I was on my way, so I'd better get the damn job because I wasn't gonna turn back. After a bunch of hemming and hawing, the guy on the phone said, 3 months. 3 months. That's all we can guarantee. I heard him and I replied, "Do you cover childbirth?" 2.5 years later, I quit my job as speechwriter, burned out. Benna pregnant again. We got in a car and headed out east. I had no idea what I was looking for. None. I got a phone call in New York City from Pat Lucey, the governor. I had worked hard for him and had served him loyally even when I disagreed strongly with policies he was pursuing. By the way, I can tell you that history has shown that he was usually right. We talked on the phone, and he offered me the job of insurance commissioner in the state of Wisconsin, making me the youngest insurance commissioner in the country. I took it. More advice. Always assume good faith, my mother's lesson. And always leave a good taste in their mouth when you leave a place. Always leave a good taste in their mouth when you leave a place. Life's a long game. Things come back over and over again. The reason Pat Lucy was so generous to me is because he knew me, because I'd been loyal to him, because I hadn't gone out and leaked to the press when I disagreed with him. He knew me and he trusted me, and therefore he wasn't afraid to risk what would be a controversial appointment. 4 years later, my term over, Benna pregnant, I was out of work again. No safety net, 2 kids, and a third on the way. You don't need to hear the rest of this story, but you get the idea. When I was in Mississippi in the 1960s, I heard a story from Fannie Lou Hamer, the great civil rights pioneer, about then Senator Hubert Humphrey, a great civil rights champion, who was soon to be President Lyndon Johnson's vice president. Senator Humphrey was sent to the Freedom Democrats. This is a group of, quote, radical, meaning they included some blacks, Mississippi delegates who wanted to be seated at the Democratic National Convention. And Lyndon Johnson didn't want any disruption. He didn't want to have a big public fight and so on. So he sent Hubert Humphrey to talk to the Freedom Democrats because Hubert Humphrey was a champion of civil rights. And he sat there talking to them and to Fannie Lou Hamer, and Humphrey told her that if they didn't compromise, Lyndon Johnson wouldn't make him vice president. Fannie Lou Hamer, telling the story, looks up and says, "Don't worry, Mr. Humphrey," she said. "I've been out of work many times, and the Lord has provided. If you're not the vice president, the Lord will provide." I've repeated that story to myself many times over the years. The Lord will provide. And indeed, he has. So much good luck. If I hadn't gotten a scholarship that took me to Amherst College, if I hadn't received a fellowship, thanks to that education, that paid my way through graduate school at Harvard, if I hadn't left graduate school to work on the speechwriting staff of the Eugene McCarthy anti-war presidency campaign, where I met the love of my life, if I hadn't had a thesis advisor at Harvard who found me a funding source for my dissertation research, if I hadn't gotten that job interview and offer out of the blue in Concord, if Governor Lucey hadn't reached out to me after I left his office, if I hadn't connected with the man who became my boss and mentor for 10 years at Beloit College, and if I brought this up to date, I'd have to mention dozens and dozens of trustees and donors and mentors and colleagues whose generosity and wisdom saved me and my job many times over the past 21 years. If you think that whatever success you are granted in life is due only to your own efforts, you won't have much success. It takes a village. Which brings me back to the faith and the lessons learned from my mom. You don't do it on your own. You don't deserve the credit for whatever others think you achieve. If you assume that everyone's out to get you, that the arc of the universe is tilted towards injustice, that's probably what you'll see and experience. If you take the best of what's been given you by your family and friends and teachers and mentors, always recognizing that it is a gift and not something you deserve, and build on it, looking for the good in everyone you meet. If you don't cheat on your family, your work, or the highest ideals of your nation, if you never lose your faith that whatever happens tomorrow, something will come up to move the planet along, then even when you're down, you'll soon be up. The poet Carl Sandburg is credited with the story of a stranger who arrives at a new town and asks the first person he meets, "What kind of people live in this community? What kind of people were in the place you left?" "They were mean, nasty people." That's what you'll find here. A second stranger arrives with the same question and gets the same question in response. "They were wonderful, generous people. I hated to leave them." That's exactly the kind of people you will meet here. My mom had the answer. It's taken me a lifetime to figure that out. Thank you.
Thank you, President. I don't know if it's on.
You're supposed to be able to ask me questions. I've given you a talk that offers you no opportunities to ask questions. So please feel free. Even though I'm standing in the way of pizza and cake, my normal diet.
I think Derek has one to start us off, if we can figure it out.
Hello, is it working? Okay, sweet. What has been your greatest challenge that you've seen as president?
My greatest challenge that I've seen as president. Dealing with so many wonderful students. They're just so wonderful. It's hard to, I say it often, and almost every day I believe it, because I've got the best job in the world. And it's not to say that there aren't challenges. There are hard days, and there have been a few hard days this year, most of them involving student illness or in some cases death. That's very hard. But it's hard to, I tend to look forward, as ought to be clear from the speech. If I take anything away from my mother, it's that I'm not a real good person at looking back. So I don't remember the greatest challenges going back. I think about the great challenges coming forward. And the greatest challenge we have coming forward is to raise the money for a new science center. And believe me, the next 8 months of my life, 7.5 months of my life will be spent trying to move that ball up a hill. It's an immense challenge because it's a $50, $60, $70 million building. And North Central has so many wonderful, wonderful alumni, but it doesn't have a lot of rich alumni. So just remember, a few of you, it's really important. Seriously, it's not if you've got a lot of alumni who are teachers, and a lot of alumni who are preachers, and a lot of alumni who are social workers, and I love all those alumni. I'm proud of it. It's a wonderful thing. This is a fabulous institution, but yeah, you need a few rich ones too. And ideally, the rich ones who started out as a social worker or a teacher, so they get it. But then somewhere along the line, they invented Google. More questions? Come on. This is, at the Pizza with a Prez, I don't let anyone eat the pizza. about some questions?
What has been your single favorite memory here at North Central?
You know, my answer to that question, which has been asked before, is it's kind of like saying, which one of your 3 children is your favorite child? It's not something that you can easily say. And in this case, I sometimes refer some of my cabinet colleagues are here and they know I talk about sort of my all-time highlight reel. But I have an incredible array of moments. Some of them on the stage, many of them on, down at the Benedict Wilde Stadium. But they're countless kinds of things where I can see the students singing. I can see the theater event occurring. And then there's tons of moments when you, we had a graduate of, 3 years ago, Farah Kanadi. I don't know if many of you knew her, remarkable young woman from Afghanistan originally, became an American citizen, came to America at age 13 with a third grade education and no English, and graduated from North Central College, and wrote a book that was a bestseller. Remarkable person. You know, when she started walking across the stage, and she had an artificial leg and stuff, she came walking across the stage. Yeah, those are the moments that you kind of lose it, but you kind of say, my God, I got the best job in the world. What an incredible thing to be in a position like that. And I have moment after moment after moment like that if I allow myself to think about it. I say, I'm not usually somebody who looks back. I'm usually somebody who's looking forward. But believe me, the greatest compensation I've had here is moments like that. And I'd say that, as I sometimes say to faculty, that's the best compensation they ever get as well, is those kind of moments that all of you give them. And those of you who go out to be teachers or coaches, you'll know what I mean. It's not about the money. You don't want to be screwed, but it's not about the money. It's about what you carry away, and it's about impacting lives and feeling good about it. Presidents actually have far fewer of those moments than teachers, because presidents are kind of removed from a lot of things. But one of the great blessings of living in the middle of campus is that I've had some opportunity to get to know students over all my years here. And those things, yeah, incandescent moments, absolutely incandescent moments. More questions? Well, the big guy standing up there, they don't ask questions. They just... My wife is saying it's time for pizza. That's she pulls the hook. But I'm a ham, yes.
Hi. Is this working? Okay. How would you define success?
I think that, success, if you want to make it personal, success is having a life that you find fulfilling. And I've been very lucky. If you're not privileged to meet somebody that you love with all your heart, all your life, well, I have been. That kind of success makes all kinds of other success possible. But bottom line is that, my daddy's old thing, which is don't bleed for the whole world and screw up your own family. I don't ever forget that. I say, you begin in your house. Take care of your house. Take care of your home. And if your house includes North Central College, you take care of your home. And so you can find success in little ways that kind of accumulate. I think everyone has to define success differently. For me, money has never been an important part of how I think about success. Doesn't mean, I've been fortunate. We haven't starved and we have a very nice, wonderful life. But that seems to me to be a very kind of limited calculus. The real calculus is when you wake up on your birthday and your daughter calls you and sings happy birthday.
What's the number one thing you want to do once you retire?
What I tell people, the reason for that is that my wife works in the cities, and she has an important job, and she's going to continue doing it, at least like part of it in these 2 years. And so my most important job in the next 5 years is probably her boyfriend. Why did I run marathons? I don't know. I really don't. I ran 3 marathons as I was crossing the 60 barrier, and I ran 2 Chicago marathons, and I kind of like to run another one when I crossed the 70 barrier in 2 years. I thought it was good discipline. I thought it was good for me. I found it very the training for a marathon is a wonderful thing. Gives you, especially when you're in a busy job where there's lots and lots of things going on all the time. The nice thing about training to run a marathon is that you're basically out there alone. You can kind of pull your head together. So I enjoyed the training, and some of you may remember a couple of years ago I fell running, and when I fell I had my first break really my whole life, and it was more of a trauma than I would have thought, partly because it affected the way I think about running, and so I do a lot of walking these days and less running, although my superintendent here is getting me back to kind of and I'm hoping that I can get back to doing it real soon. What's that? Pizza, she says. She says pizza. I listen. All the women, including your girlfriend and your boyfriend, especially if you've been married to her for 42 years. Thank you very much. What's that? My God. It's a North Central t-shirt. I only have 420. Thank you.